broadcasting yet. Just a minute.
So what's broadcasting? Just the slides or our entire session?
No, it's the entire section. Yeah.
Oh, bummer! I should have worn a tie.
You can use pajama. It's not a problem.
I'm still like almost sitting in my bed. We are 2 hours behind, as you know.
No, but you look like very good because it's the first time I see you dressing a red color. No, very good.
See, like dress for success. I learned it in the business school. But if I had known, I would have borrowed a tie somewhere. Yeah.
Okay.
Like Brazilians are a bit more formal, right?
People can
more formal. I don't think so.
People can already see us in YouTube. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for the warning. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We are just gossiping, no?
That was really interesting what you told me there, Rosangela.
Sorry.
That was really juicy. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let me see. The public is just arriving in the room, at least the chat I have here. But I like to introduce Peter Muller. No, it's in fact a great honor to receive Peter Muller here because it's a very good friend from. I cannot say from when because it was the last century, you know. But Peter Muller is a very nice people and big name in Bayesian statistics. He has a lot of contributions in many areas, but very important contributions in non-parametric Bayesian. Is one reference in this area around the world. Peter is now a professor at Texas, University of Texas. But he was in Duke before, and the MD Anderson Cancer Center, no? I guess it's the name, you know? But Peter has more than 2,000 to, I don't remember how many papers do you have published?
Not 2,000, it was
not 2,000, yeah, 200 papers, no? And many books, right? He was a past president of ISBA, and he served as a treasurer as well. And I remember very well when we were organizing the COBAL 1, the first Latin America meeting on Bayesian statistics. Peter gave us some support that helped us to give some support for the students. In that period, he was the treasurer of ISBA. Then, Peter, for me, it's a real pleasure to receive you here. Many thanks for spending your time speaking for us. I know you are a very busy guy. It's for me a great honor. I will leave you more or less alone. I will just take my image and my sound from the screen. And if you need something, it's just say for me that I come back. Okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. So I want to tell you something about analyzing data like this cartoon here. This is a cartoon of the kind of data we are looking at. You see in the rows, you see many patients. So each line here is a patient. In the columns are symptoms. So on a large number of patients, we are recording some symptoms. Typically, the symptoms are eventually recorded binary or trinary. And here's what we want to find. We want to find things like the red box. Means we want to find subsets of patients who have the same subset of symptoms. Well, more or less. A subset of patients matched with a subset of symptoms, we simply call it a disease. A set of patients who have the same symptoms is simply a disease. So we want to find diseases in this data. This kind of data is also known as EMR, electronic medical records. So what we are doing here is like phenotype mining. We are trying to find diseases in this data. The particular data comes from small towns in northeast China, and in particular older patients, and they have a lot of diseases. In particular, you have to allow for a patient having more than one disease. You can see, for example, patient 6 and 7, they have the red disease as well as the green disease. You have to allow for some patients maybe not having, some subjects maybe not having any disease. That is possible because this data comes from routine medical exams. So it's possible that they have nothing. I describe the disease now as the rectangle there, like the red one, the green one, the yellow one, the blue one. I could have alternatively described it, for example, the red rectangle is characterized by a subset of patients, which is the vertical bar, the vertical red bar on the right side, paired with a subset of symptoms, which is like the horizontal red bar on the top. So I can think of my diseases also as pairs of subsets. Pairs of subsets on two sets of experimental units. There's my patients and there are the symptoms. And if I have a pair of subsets, that describes a disease. The problem that we are dealing with in such data, and this is obviously a cartoon, in reality we have something like 80,000 patients. In such kind of data, we want to find pairs of patients and symptoms that can characterize diseases. I could have told the same story in different words. I could have told it in terms of a graphical picture. So here on the right-hand side, you see exactly the same thing again. The patients are the nodes on the top. On the top, you can see patients 1 through 11. The symptoms are the boxes at the bottom, in this case, 1 through 6. And the edges, they characterize which symptom is recorded for which patient. In this kind of representation, introducing or discovering diseases amounts to imputing a hidden third layer. Like we could hypothesize that the data, which is the network on top, arises from a tripartite model with a hidden central layer. Can you see the central layer has now the triangles with the colors actually matching the picture on the left side, where each central layer node is connected with a top layer node and bottom layer nodes, and could potentially explain exactly the same thing. So alternatively, I could have introduced a problem instead of as finding pairs of subsets. I could have said we want to make inference about a tripartite graph when you only observe the marginal of the top and the bottom layer. And all what I'm going to do in the next so many minutes is I'll talk you through the details of setting it up, but essentially this was the sufficient statistic. This was joint work with Yang Ni, who is now at Texas A&M. That's the other great statistics department in Texas. And UMG at University of Chicago Biostat. All three of us a while ago were at MD Anderson Cancer Center. Yang Ni used to be a student at Rice, who have a joint PhD program with MD Anderson Cancer Center. And at the bottom, you can see a URL. If anyone cares for a copy of the slides, at that URL, you should be able to download a verbatim copy of the slides. So what's coming up now, just I'll talk a bit more through the data. I'll slowly develop an explicit model that we use to describe these pairs of subsets. And then I'll talk you through some alternative representations of the problem, including one representation which is related to matrix factorization. That's why it's by way of explaining the title. The construction of paired subsets, that's what we call double feature allocation. So that explains the second part of the title. And the first part of the title, matrix factorization, is yet another way of thinking about the same problem. Some more details about the data. There is some 80,000 patients from rural northeast China. What's happening there is this is actually a company who sends like vans across small towns. Those are like vans or buses equipped with some diagnostic equipment or some stuff to carry out preventive medical exams. And then subjects, they need not have any disease. They go through that, and there's probably a nurse going along with that bus, and patients go through the bus, and they take data on a number of variables. What we do is we take these variables, which are things like blood pressure and whatever your doctor would take at your routine medical exam. We reduce this to a set of binary and trinary symptoms, depending on the variable. Like gender would become binary. Things like blood pressure might become trinary because it might be normal, too high or too low. So in the end, we have binary and trinary data. Y is the data for the IF patient, with G indexing the symptoms. So YIG is the chief symptom for the IF patient. I'll try to consistently keep I and J for patients and symptoms. The data includes some data on actually recorded diseases, like there's actually data on diabetes status. Obviously, we're not going to make inference about these known diseases. We are looking for additional diseases that might be relevant in this patient population. The whole idea is once you know which diseases different patients might have, either that might help, it might be a decision support tool for clinicians or for physicians to review these medical exams, or even for the nurse who works there, if there is a suggestion that this or this disease might be present, they might look for more. So we want to look for hidden diseases beyond the already recorded diagnosis. That's the problem. Now, one default way to look for hidden structure in the data, if it were not trinary, if it were continuous, what you might want to do is just look for correlations of the symptoms, and then maybe look for correlations of the symptoms, maybe represented in terms of a graphical model, which typically amounts to assuming a multivariate normal model with the conditional independence structure being mapped to the edges of the graph, with the absence of an edge corresponding to conditional independence, means a 0 in the precision matrix. And then we could do something like we could identify cliques in the graph, like symptoms that tend to occur together. We could identify that as potential as candidates for diseases. Could be done. So a reasonably popular thing to do is to analyze such data using graphical models. There's a little bit of an issue if the thing is binary or trinary, but you can obviously always have an additional hierarchical layer. So using a graphical model, we could try to learn about conditional independence structure, and then identify some feature of that graph with candidates for diseases. For example, we could take cliques of symptoms, where cliques are subsets in the graph that are completely connected. Could be done, and this picture shows it. It's not too much you can tell in this particular case, right? With a little bit of fantasy, we could hypothesize some candidates for diseases here, but there's a couple of problems. One problem is that there's no explicit notion of introducing diseases in the model. We're just ad hoc identifying cliques with potential diseases. And another problem is it's not linked to patients. Like here we are only dealing with modeling modeling something at the level of the symptoms. We wouldn't know in the end which patients we should potentially flag for a second look. Alternatively, we could do clustering of the symptoms, means trying to do inference for unknown partition of the symptoms, and then we could call persistent clusters, we could call a disease. Clustering might be as simple as just k-means or your favorite algorithm or machine learning tool. Again, the problem is there's no link to patients. You could obviously overcome that by doing the clustering on both dimensions, like back to the title slide with the data. We could cluster the columns for the symptoms, as well as the rows for the patients, and then we get inference like this. So of course, one minor issue is, remember on the title slide, we want to find rectangles. Instead of rectangles, we find here really a grid, right? Which is a bit different. So it's not quite obvious what to do with that. If you do it with the standardized data, as I did it on that left figure here, it's difficult to say anything. Maybe with some fantasy, you can see some grid cells that might be suspicious. You might call some synchronized, like some grid cells that are either very green or very red. You could call them candidates for disease. Dealing with the actual categorical data using a favorite method for clustering categorical data, and I don't even remember which one we used here. It looks a little bit more promising, although it's kind of short of identifying rectangles. It's really just chasing after grids, which of course we can then in some ad hoc way of post-processing inference we can relate to rectangles. That means diseases. So again, it's a way to proceed, but perhaps not the optimal one. I'm trying to build here a story to convince you that we really want a model. I'm trying to build up to building a model that explicitly includes a notion of these rectangles in my data metrics as we had it on the title slide. And it's exactly what's coming up. Maybe one more thing, because that's becoming an increasingly popular modeling feature for high-dimensional data. Just about everyone uses now latent vector models to deal with high-dimensional outcomes. Our data is not that high-dimensional. It's high-dimensional in terms of the patients. Like these 80,000 patients is not big data with CAP-B, but it's big enough that clustering or so becomes an issue. It's not that high-dimensional in terms of the response. We have, did I tell you, we have something like 41 symptoms in the end. It's not super high-dimensional, but still we could use vector analysis to reduce the CAP-S equal 41 symptoms. So our data metrics for n patients and CAP-S symptoms is an n by s binary matrix that was on the left side of the title slide. And using vector analysis, using a vector analysis model, you're essentially carrying out, essentially factorizing the data into lower dimensional matrices, one n by k matrix of vector loadings, and one n by k matrix of the actual vector levels, and the k by s matrix of vector loadings. And then we could simply interpret the vectors as diseases. It's a little bit of a stretch, but especially if we were to use like a sparse vector model, that might become possible to interpret, and many of you might know that better than me. There is a whole literature of doing the same thing, essentially matrix factorization, but without so I think of vector analysis as a matrix factorization in the context of a probability model, so it's all kosher and proper. But our friends from applied math, there's a whole literature on carrying out matrix factorization without reference to a probability model, including explicitly factorizing binary matrices. So think of that, let's forget for a moment the trinary symptoms and just think of it as a binary n by s matrix. Then you could describe the issue of discovering diseases as just a problem of factorizing a binary matrix, a lower dimensional factorization of the binary matrix. And that's a reasonably traditional problem in applied math, and they're very clever about doing that. But they don't get probabilities in the end. I already hinted what we might want to do in the end with the posterior distribution, the posterior inference on the unknown diseases and how they are linked with patients. We can then make decisions like the nurse or whoever runs that program, they can make a decision on maybe things like how often should they visit the towns, how should they perhaps change the tests that they carry out. Should they maybe invite some patients for a second look? That's a very traditional thing to do. like you can always do more with these patients, but you cannot afford to do it for everyone. But if you could identify the patients who are most at risk, that would be a very useful thing to do. That kind of problem arises a lot in biostat. So I talked you a little bit through possible alternative approaches, just trying to get you brainwashed into following my argument, into building a model that takes the story from the title slide more serious in terms of trying to identify diseases simply as pairs of subsets. So we are going in the next few slides, we're going to build a model for pairs of subsets, and it has to be matched pairs of subsets so that I can draw my rectangles on the title slide. I want to have pairs, I want to have subsets of patients. Those will be the subsets on the rows. And on the next slide, I will match that subset of patients with a subset of symptoms. Inference for subsets, the most popular inference for subsets in terms of statistical inference, especially in our corner of statistics, in Bayesian statistics, and even more so in non-parametric base. The most popular inference for subsets is inference on partitions, means on a family of subsets that are non-overlapping and whose union covers covers the entire set of units, in our case, patients. And there are many methods to carry out to find a partition, also known as clustering. However, I tried to already convince you a partition is not what we really want here, because first of all, a partition requires that each patient is only in one subset. That is unrealistic here. Many of these elderly Chinese folks have multiple diseases. And secondly, the union need not be all the patients. There could be some patients who don't have any disease. And the general inference for just finding subsets without restriction to non-overlap and exhaustive, that is known as feature allocation. So what we want to start with here is we want to start with a feature allocation to find a random number of subsets of our patients. And we want to, so I'm going to give you a probability model for feature allocation, means for a random number of subsets. In writing out that probability model, I need to represent the random number of subsets. And here's one way of representing the random number of subsets. There's other ways, and everyone has their favorite. One way of representing an unknown number of subsets for a given number of units, in our case patients, is in terms of building up a binary matrix. So at the bottom of the slide, we are going to build up our subsets. Patient 1 is in subset 1. The subsets will become our diseases, so already labeled it disease. Patient 1 might have disease 1. Patient 2 might not have disease 1, but instead has disease 2. Patient 3 might again have disease 1, and so on. Patient 4 has yet another disease. Patient 4 has a new disease, has disease 3, and also happens to have disease 1. Disease 1 is becoming a very popular disease with these elderly Chinese patients. It's probably something like high blood pressure. Just about all of them probably have it. You also notice part of that constructive definition, or so far really only representation of my random number of subsets, was that I indexed the subsets by appearance. Disease number 1 or subset number 1 was what patient 1 had. And then as new diseases appear, I index them with the next integer. All the way down to my patient number 80,000. Patient number 80,000 has some of the earlier diseases, and patient number 80,000 has one more new disease, disease number 5. Did you notice in particular the way how we wrote down that binary matrix that now represents my unknown number of subsets? I did allow for an unknown number of columns. I did not fix the number of diseases up front, which is fitting because initially you don't know how many diseases you might find there. The right upper corner of the matrix, where I have all blanks, that is just zeros. Like I don't write the blanks just to keep it from being too crowded. It's all zeros. So now I have a binary matrix A that represents the unknown, that represents a random number of subsets of patients. Let's call it the green feature allocation, the green subsets. And by way of constructing the green subsets, I have already generated a random number, in this case of k equal 5 diseases. And
Peter.
Yes.
I have a question. Luis Salazar has a question for you. Can you read it, or can I read it?
Oh, sorry. I see there's many comments. Sorry, I was looking on a different screen. Can the feature allocation be seen as a partition? If you consider that a patient might fall into subsets of all diseases. But so in a partition, don't we have to restrict to each unit, in this case patient, being only a member in one subset? But we want to allow for patients to be a member in multiple subsets. That said, I could still, like, if we really have to represent it as a partition, we could. If we invent subsets for, there's the subset of people who only have high blood pressure, there's the subset of people who have high blood pressure and high cholesterol, there's the subset of patients who have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and tell me another bad thing, high blood sugar. So if we call each of these unique combination of diseases a cluster, then actually it could work. So you could squeeze it into that setup. So quick answer, yes, but it might be better to upfront model it the way how you want to think about it. I see there's lots of other, this was just people signing in, right? Other questions, I see lots of comments, but I think they were just people signing in. Thank you. Any other comments? What is the difference between +1 and -1? That is, some of the symptoms are binary, like having diabetes or not might just be binary. Then I just record a 0 or a 1. Some symptoms, did I say diseases? I meant symptoms. Some symptoms are more naturally recorded as trinary, like blood pressure could be high, that's bad. It could be very low, that's equally bad, or it could be normal. Something like blood pressure you might record as trinary. Other things you might only record as binary. Honest answer, it's a little arbitrary how you code it. You could, of course, code everything as categorical or some even as metric, but binary and trinary seems natural. Most of my discussion, so far we only talked about allocating the diseases to patients. We are not yet talking about symptoms. So at this moment, the A matrix is entirely binary. The next matrix, the B matrix that's coming up, that will link the diseases to symptoms. At that moment, will eventually allow for trinary. But quick answer, you lose absolutely nothing. You lose nothing if you restrict everything to just binary and ignore the -1s. Thank you, good comment. So essentially in the previous slide, I just told you a representation, but I promised you a probability model on the random subsets. So we need a probability model for the binary matrix A. A popular probability model there is known as the Indian buffet process. In non-parametric Bayes, we have some type of obsession with food because there's the popular Chinese restaurant process. This is the Indian buffet process, and I think there are many others. All what I need now is I need probability distributions for all the moves that I introduced in the previous slide. To start with, the first patient has some number of diseases. In my previous slide, it was just one, but the first patient could have had any Poisson number of diseases, including 0. The first person could have had no disease. So I'll generate a Poisson random variable to get the number of diseases for the first person. And so on. Then for patient number I+1, I have to first decide whether patient number I+1 has some of the earlier diseases. And short summary, you allocate some of the earlier diseases to patient number I+1 with a probability that's related to how popular the disease is. It's not exactly the frequency of the disease in the earlier patients, because there's I earlier patients, but we divide the denominator there on the right-hand side is I+1. Numerator is simply the frequency, how often we observe the disease earlier, and then we divide by I+1. But so it's simply the more popular diseases, the more likely you are to get it. And then the new patient has a certain number of new diseases with, again, a Poisson random variable. You see that the Poisson rate becomes smaller as we see more and more patients. And that sounds right, because by the time we have seen 5,000 patients, it's just becoming less and less likely that the next patient has a disease that we haven't seen yet. So it's a Poisson rate that decreases as we see more and more patients. That way we can fill out the E matrix. And actually this was a constructive, this was a complete description of the popular IBP model, the Indian buffer process. Alternatively, you can simply think of it as a probability model for a binary matrix. It's special because with some caveats that I shall sweep under the carpet for the moment, it's exchangeable in terms of the patients and even the columns, the diseases. Like, you don't want a patient to be more sick because he or she happens to be seen earlier. You really want something that's like symmetric in terms of the patients. So at this moment we have, let's call it the patient disease model, which we introduced as a feature allocation model, the most popular of those models being the Indian buffer process. We still need the second part of the construction. We need to link the diseases now with the symptoms. On the cover slide, on the title slide, that would have been the subset, the column subsets, like the horizontal bars in the picture to make my rectangles. And what I'll do now, on the previous slide, I had my prior probability model on the binary matrix A, which I introduced as the Indian buffer process. I have to augment that now to a prior probability model, not only on one binary matrix, but a pair of binary matrices, A and B, where B will now be a binary matrix to link the diseases to symptoms. And eventually, I still owe you a sampling model to link my patients' diseases and symptoms to the actually reported symptoms. That's coming up. Short summary, I'll simply write down a logistic regression when it comes to it. So back to our model. On the previous slide, we allocated diseases to patients, and we recorded it as the binary matrix A, including an unknown number of diseases. In this case, we generated 5 diseases. Now I still have to link my diseases with the symptoms, and that's coming up now in the orange matrix, which will become the matrix B. For each symptom, I'll simply flip coins to decide whether that symptom is related to any of the diseases that we have. So in the first row, the first symptom, I link only with disease 1. What I'm doing here is I'm describing a generative model. By writing out everything I say now, we have a prior probability model for the paired feature, for the double feature allocation. Symptom 2 is linked with disease number 2 and 4, and so on, down to the last symptom, number S equal 40, that's linked with diseases 4 and 5. Notice that second binary matrix, the number of columns, the number of diseases, that is fixed now already. That's already known. The number of diseases was implicitly generated in my construction of E. So B in that way is actually much easier and simpler. So while the matrix A defined the green subsets of patients, the matrix B now characterizes random orange subsets of symptoms. I actually gave notation there, C and D to the patient, to the green subsets and orange subsets. And while for the green binary matrix, I used the Indian buffer process because it's computationally easy and we understand it. I still need a probability model for the orange matrix, for the B matrix. And I'm going to make that as cheap and easy as it possibly gets I simply do independent coin flips. With beta JK, I denote the entries of the orange matrix, the B matrix. The B matrix is now a cap S by cap K matrix, right? I need to link each of the S symptoms with each of the cap K diseases. And what I simply do is, for each symptom and disease, I flip a coin whether or not to link it with a hyperprior on the success probability. Doesn't get easier than that. So I simply flip coins to decide which disease I want to link with which symptoms. Now the issue arises if I have only binary symptoms, then that's enough, because I only have to say whether a symptom is linked with a disease or not. When I have symptoms that are recorded trinary, I have to be a bit more detailed. We want to record whether a symptom is linked with a disease in an inhibiting or enhancing way, like is a disease linked with high blood pressure or low blood pressure or none. So for that, I want to allow trinary links. So I'll generalize from the binary matrix to a trinary matrix. Now we also allow for the -1. And all what I simply do is I flip three-sided coins. By flipping three-sided coins with probabilities pi -1, pi 0, and pi 1. And instead of a beta prior that I had for, up there for the binary symptoms, I now have the three-dimensional generalization of a beta prior as a Dirichlet distribution. It's a natural generalization. So at that moment, I have the orange matrix, either B for the binary symptoms or C for the trinary symptoms. So I have a complete prior probability model. The only thing that is still owe at this moment, I have to link the symptoms, I have to link the diseases with the observed data. Remember, Y sub ij was the observed symptom J for patient I. So Yij could be ±1 for binary symptoms, or could be ±1 or 0 for trinary symptoms, or it could be just 0, 1 for binary symptoms. And what we simply do here is, in plain words, I just do a logistic regression. I do a logistic regression of the observed data, Yij, on indicators for diseases that are shared by the respective patient and disease. So on the right-hand side, you see that sum. There's something goofy with my LaTeX. It should be a sum that runs over k = 1 to cap k. It's a sum over all diseases. And we only include those diseases that are linked to the given patient, means Aik is 1, as well as linked to the given symptom, means Bjk is equal 1. So that indicator selects those diseases that are linked with patient I and symptom J. And for the observed data, we are just doing a regression on those selected diseases. The regression coefficients are then the Wjk. And for different symptoms, we also still allow for some common offset, like some symptoms are simply more common than others. That's it. At this moment, we have a complete probability model for everything. Previous two slides, we had a prior for pairs of random subsets. I should have mentioned at that moment, a prior for one family of random subsets is known as feature allocation. By the same token, a prior for pairs of random subsets, we call it double feature allocation. And now we have linked our random structure, those pairs of subsets. We have linked it with the data by way of a simple logistic regression. Doesn't get easier than that. So in principle, we can now carry out inference. One more footnote. The logistic regression up there by default is just for binary symptoms. For trinary symptoms, we just need a categorical extension of binary logistic regression. So what you have there at the bottom is essentially a log linear model or a trinary logistic regression, where we have now not only 0, 1, but 0, 1, 2 as possible levels. That completes the description. In principle, we can now carry out posterior simulation. I want to still talk a bit more about alternative representations. I already told you about the graphical model representation. I could have described the same problem as inference on a latent third layer in a tripartite graph. Or I could have described the same problem as factorization. Sorry, we could have described it as by clustering. I already mentioned that when we talked through the title slide. Just want to follow up with some references. There's a long-standing literature on bi-clustering for having partitions on both dimensions. It a little bit misses the problem because it really goes after grids rather than rectangles. But there's quite some literature for that, especially in the operations research literature. Some of it, though, without reference to explicit probability models. And I already mentioned that some folks address the same problem just as a problem of matrix factorization, which is totally legitimate and actually comes close to, follows or echoes our construction too, because I could have written the whole thing as here you can see again the A matrix. So the A matrix is the matrix that links patients with diseases. So the columns here are the number of diseases, or if you think vector models, the columns are the latent vectors. And then I could have pulled what I wrote out as a logistic regression, where I had latent binary matrix B, and then I multiplied with coefficients W. We could have pulled those coefficients into the B matrix. After pulling the coefficients into the B matrix, let's call it D. And so for binary, we would only need one D matrix. And then we could have characterized the problem alternatively as a binary matrix factorization. And for the trinary symptoms, it becomes two matrix factorizations. One with the binary, one with the matrix D minus, one with the matrix D plus. Could have done that. Instead, we would like to advertise our model with a constructive prior probability model on these pairs of latent subsets. How are we doing in time? I had two simulations in the actual data, and then I want to tell you something about the MCMC. Let's do the following thing. I'll just quickly jump to the picture of my simulation because the picture makes us look good. What you can see there now on top is that's the simulation truth. It's a simulation. On the left, you see the true A matrix. So in that true A matrix, the first column is a very popular disease. Everyone wants it. The last column is a much rarer disease, etc. The matrix B links the same diseases now to the symptoms, to binary symptoms, and the matrix C links the same diseases to trinary symptoms, where green and red corresponds to plus minus 1. And we slightly cheated because under this simulation, the data was generated under our model. That's why I can talk about the simulation truth for all the ingredients of our model, the E matrix, the B matrix, and the C matrix. So when you simulate under our assumed analysis model, then we should better be able to carry out the inference, and surely enough, we can. Down there, you see the inference with, I think, a moderate number of patients, eyeballing that those must have been a couple hundred patients. And it's almost too good to be true because the estimate seems to almost perfectly recover the underlying truth. So this is almost too good to be true. There's like some that we are missing. Can you see my cursor? There's in the C matrix, there's some block that we are missing, and that's good so because it would have been too good to be true. Here's another simulation where we simulate from a different model. Actually, we simulate from a latent factor model. So this is a bit more honest. We simulate 300 hypothetical patients. The truth is we give these 300 simulated patients, we give them 6 different diseases. We carry out posterior simulation. And here is the inference that we get. On the top, you get the estimated E matrix that's linking the patients with diseases. At the bottom, you got the estimated B and C matrix, now folded into one. And I can't show you the true matrix because there is no true A, B, and C because we use the factor analysis. Instead, I can just tell you the misclassification rate, like how many of these elements, how many of these links did we get right or wrong. And I think I had it on the previous slide. The misclassification rate is something like in the tens, in the 10%, which is realistic. Actually, when you analyze the same data using a popular sparse factor analysis model, you get similar misclassification rate, even helping that model by setting the optimal choice of some of the tuning parameters. So far for the simulation, and I can still show you a quick picture from the actual data. I can't show you the links to the patients, that would become too busy. I think this is with 1,000 patients, not with all 80,000, but even with 1,000, it would become too busy. So all what you see here is the symptoms linked with the latent diseases. The diseases are the triangles. Known diseases have a name, and diseases that we additionally discovered or that we imputed, they just have a number. There were 3 known diseases, and we imputed a small number of additional diseases. Same thing for 300 patients only. It looks a little cleaner because there is a smaller number of diseases. Wanted to show you this one. This would be like for a given, like in the end you get posterior inference on everything, including we get for a given patient, pick out any patient. Here we picked like patient number 3. For patient number 3, we can report inference, how we think that patient might be linked with some of the diseases. So we can show pictures like this to the nurse or to the physician, who might use that as a hint of where to look next or what to do with that patient. I have a few minutes to briefly talk you through the posterior simulation. See, there was a problem. You were too kind, nobody brought it up. After I introduced the model, I had a complete probability model. I just sloppily said, once we have a well-specified probability model, in principle, we can carry out posterior simulation. And in principle, it's of course correct. In practice, there's a problem because there was an unknown number of subsets. There was an unknown number of latent diseases. For those of you who have burnt your fingers on this before, you probably notice what's going on. This is going to lead to trans-dimensional MCMC because we have a varying, like as you drop diseases or you add diseases, you're creating more or fewer parameters, and that leads to posterior simulation that is known as trans-dimensional MCMC, also popularly known as reversible jump MCMC. Reversible jump is very easy to explain. You can explain it in 2 slides. It's impossible to implement. It almost never really works in real data and real problems. So one problem is that we have trans-dimensional MCMC. Another problem is if you have done model-based clustering, then you probably know this becomes really iffy for large sample sizes. And so I had still a few slides to talk you through some strategies of how to do posterior simulation with large sample sizes. We have done some related work with Diane from Sao Carlos. She can tell you some tricks. And here's some alternative tricks, like poor man's versions of Diane's clever schemes for implementing posterior simulation for large sample sizes because we have 80,000 patients. So there's some literature, there's quite a few methods on doing random partitions for large sample sizes, and I mentioned some here. And it does include down there, the last item is the Yanis Vanetti from Sao Carlos, where we proposed some methods to do that. But this is a little bit more difficult here because it's not only random partitions, it's actually random subsets that could be overlapping. And so what we end up doing is we end up implementing something known as consensus Monte Carlo, which is another common trick for big sample posterior simulation. The idea of consensus Monte Carlo is essentially divide and conquer. You divide your data set into small parts. In that literature, it's known as shards. You carry out posterior simulation on each of these shards. Then you get like subset posteriors for each shard. And then in the end, you want to reconcile them. That's a reasonably popular scheme for large sample sizes, for large data. The problem is that we have a little bit a special kind of parameters here. Our unknown quantities, our unknown parameters are subsets, and that makes it a bit awkward. Consensus Monte Carlo is usually used for unknown parameters like real valued parameters or parameter vectors and works quite well. If the unknown thing happens to be subsets, it becomes tricky. Essentially, the problem is that in each shard, the unknown subsets that we are working with, they are what we like to refer to as local parameters, because an unknown subset of patients in shard 1 has nothing to do with the unknown subsets of patients in shard 2. Those are different patients. That makes it difficult to combine the subset posteriors in the end. I just try to quickly summarize it, glossing over many details. But so we have some methods that are amazingly simple, but we have suggested some methods to overcome this problem. And in the interest of time, I'll save you the details, short of saying we did something embarrassingly simple, but it actually seems to work. And doing that, we can then carry out inference with all our 80,000 patients. And this is just some quick summary of what we get there. Again, on top are the symptoms, at the bottom are the diseases. And I can't show you the links to the patients, although there is inference on the patients. If you ask for any particular patient, then we could show you inference like I showed it before for those particular patient, number 3 or whatever it was. And I think that brings me to the end of the slides. So I talked you through a probability model that could be described as categorical matrix factorization. We like to call it double feature allocation. You could have called it inference on a tripartite graph. We think that the construction by actually introducing the unknown subsets that describe a disease as the unknown parameter stays close to the original question and allows us easy inference. Computation becomes a bit of a problem because it involves transdimensional NCMC. I didn't talk you through the details of that at all. It also involves large data, big data, not big data with cap P, but still a big sample size. We overcome that by using an implementation of consensus Monte Carlo. And on top of that, by using a model that stays close to the original problem, it becomes easy to make use of informative priors. Like if you had told me, did you have some good idea of what might be linked with what diseases or what kind of diseases to look for, we could easily introduce that as informative priors in the model. I think that's all I wanted to tell you about. There's 2 papers that essentially described it. Both of them are freely available in arXiv. And again, if anyone wants a copy of the slides, you can get it at that URL down there, verbatim copy of the slides. That's all I wanted to tell you.
Very nice. Thank you so much. The public, do you have some question? Yes, you have.
I see from Flavio.
Flavio Bambira, could you read it?
How accurate is the CMC? Like what kind of errors do you introduce by doing the divide and conquer? Quick answer, unknown, because longer answer, when you set up like simulations where you can actually compare with full sample posteriors, it's not too bad. Even longer answer, it depends on the problem, like just answering it for generic consensus Monte Carlo. Here's a problem where CMC would actually be perfect. If you have an unknown normal location parameter and you split the data into subsets, and in each chart you have inference on the unknown normal location parameter, and you have a normal hyperprior, then we know exactly how to combine the subset posteriors, and we could actually exactly reconstruct what the full posterior would have been. But that's like in a very special setup. For our random subsets, we actually have no clue how faithful we remain to the full posterior. But since there's no way to get your hands on the full posterior, we feel this is still a useful thing to do. But good comment, yeah. It is not the full thing to do. Second.
Yes, second one.
How do you deal with a new subject? How do you deal with new data arising after your analysis? It's of course a very relevant question. Even in that application, remember I told you the story, it's a van or it's a bus going around those small towns. And of course, like every week you get more data because it's actually a private company who do that under contract for some public health authority. And they keep on going because they want to continue making a profit. And thank you for the question. It's almost like a paid for a question because that, of course, highlights the advantage of doing model-based inference and carrying out full posterior inference, because you could, like the posterior for today's patients would become the prior for tomorrow's patients. Or the same thing, in other words, if you use simulation-based inference using something like a particle filter, then it would be very natural to update your, to continue updating your posterior as new patients come in. Several of the methods, I jumped over that fast in the end, but several of the methods that are popular and used for big data posterior inference, they are known as streaming. And that's exactly that notion of if you have posterior simulation from yesterday's data, that becomes your prior simulation for tomorrow's data. And you implement things many of you might know, particle filters or sequential Monte Carlo. You implement essentially sequential Monte Carlo schemes. We didn't do that at all, but it's an obvious thing to do.
There are some other questions. You can do it in Portuguese if you like, then you can try to translate it.
Não, se falar devagar, muito devagar, posso entender.
That's the I forgot to say that you learned Portuguese in just 3 months to give us a course. No?
I forgot it even faster.
No. I have a question, Peter. It is incredibly good, the clusters you find, because in the simulation, no? If you compare the estimations with the truth, is wow, I will use your model. But how informative are the priors you use for the parameters, the beta prior you use or the Dirichlet prior you use for that? Because in the clusters model that I use, some priors have very strong influence in the number of clusters you detect.
Good comments. First of all, a fair point, like Rosangela essentially said very kindly that in the simulation, inference looks too good to be true, right? Because keep in mind that in the end, the data is only those binary outcomes. Like we don't observe the subsets, we only observe the binary outcomes. On the basis of those binary outcomes, we attempt to recover the underlying subsets, and that's almost too good to be true. The reason why it's so good there, I think, is because it's a very good model. No, the reason is that the data was actually simulated from the assumed model. That's probably why. And that kind of leads to the second part of your question, how informative is the prior? I think my quick answer would be not at all. It's just a generic coherent prior on the random subsets. A cheap answer would be it's a stupid prior, but any kind of prior shrinkage is better than none, right? Shrinkage is always good. In the case of that simulation, the prior shrinkage that it introduced was, of course, perfect because it was exactly where the data came from since we simulated from that model. Generally, though, it's not a very informative prior because the IVP that we use uses a single parameter, and that's not very informative. However, if you had any expert prior information that could be incorporated, the easiest way to incorporate it would be if a physician tells me about some possible links, I would try to elicit that information in terms of hypothetical representative patients, and that way I could introduce informative prior information just by incrementing the data set. And I think we got two more questions there.
Yes. Guido?
Has the disease allocation been put against living physicians' assessment? Honest answer, no. Longer answer, there's no pretense or no attempt whatsoever to replace actual physician judgment. It would be crazy, yeah? You would surely not want to be treated by our model, right? It's really just meant, like it's meant as a decision support tool. It's meant to just point out what things might be worth looking at. So quick answer, we didn't connect it. We didn't connect back to the people where the data came from. Even longer answer, there is the data that we actually used in the paper in the end was not the real data, but we had to use a fake replicate of the data to comply with Chinese restrictions and law. By Chinese law policy, you can only publish on paper after Chinese researchers published on it. So we were bound to comply with that, and that's how we sidestepped that. So the honest answer, quick answer, no. And there was a second question. That's just a comment on trauma. Me giving a talk in Portuguese. Sorry, I mutilated your beautiful language. But that's a long time ago. There's a statute of limitation. 2004. Oh my God, 15 years ago.
It was not a talk. It was a short course.
That's right. Yeah. I remember working hard in getting the right Portuguese term. Hi, Daiane. I worked hard on getting the right Portuguese term for stick breaking. Forgot it. What was it? Do you remember, Rosangela? Stick breaking prior. I worked.
Quebra de palito ou alguma coisa assim. That was the translation for Portuguese.
Sounds right to me.
Okay.
We did not have the Indian buffet process at that time, right?
No.
Buffetta Indiano?
No, that time I just have heard about partition models, the one I used to work, but now Chinese restaurant process Indian. I have heard sometime about that, and I am waiting for the Italian buffet because there are many Italians working with non-parametric Bayesian, perhaps sometimes.
Careful, it's lunchtime here, and I'm hungry already. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see. Someone have any other question or comment? If you don't, I just like to thank Peter again. Great paper, great job, and thanks so much for for giving us the talk, to stay with us, no? For spend your time here with us. And sorry.
Thank you for the opportunity to do this. It was quite an honor. Thank you.
And you said that the slides is in your web page, no?
That's right. Like on the title slide, there was a URL. You can find it, yeah. Or email me and I respond with the PDF file. And
anyway, the videos will be available as well. This talk, okay? Then see you next Friday. Have a nice weekend. Bye.
Bom fim de semana. Bye.